The October 7, 2023 attack on Israel was brutal, savage, inhuman, and condemned unanimously across the globe. Israel had a unique opportunity to get Hamas isolated and get the rest of the world on its side. But with Benjamin Netanyahu at its helm, it chose war, an open-ended war which did not seem to have an end in sight. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a look at Israel's response post the October 7 attacks, how it unfolded, and how gradually it led to a human catastrophe. As the attack unfolded, Israel's cabinet met and declared war on Hamas. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu asserted that Israel would win, but it would be a long and difficult campaign. As per Israel, its primary aim was to eradicate Hamas. So in the afternoon on October 7, Israel started pounding Gaza with air attacks. 24 hours later, Hezbollah, which is based out of Lebanon, started launching rocket attacks, announcing its support for the people of Gaza. So if you look at the map of Israel, it's shaped like an ice puck, and its longest border is with Egypt on the southwest and Jordan on the southeast. The Gaza Strip is a thin strip of land which borders Egypt on its southern end and Israel on its eastern end. The west coast of both Gaza and Israel borders the Mediterranean Sea, and Israel borders Lebanon on the north and Syria on the northeast. So a day after facing the October 7 attacks on its western side from Gaza, Israel was pounded by a rocket attack from Lebanon on its northern border. And because of this, the Israeli population in the northern rim had to be evacuated and moved further south. Wow. So had it been a more full-scale attack, Israel would have had a challenge managing two sides of its border simultaneously. As it turns out, it was supposed to be an all-out attack. The Israeli Defense Forces, or the IDF, found bunkers up against the northern border fully equipped for Hezbollah fighters to launch an all-out invasion. So why didn't it happen? Well, as I mentioned in the previous episode, the execution of the October 7 attack was kept very secret, and even Hezbollah was surprised by the timing of the attack. And by the time Hezbollah was able to manage to get its forces together to launch an attack, Israel had already massed its troops along the northern border. Also, within the first week, US President Joe Biden sent an unprecedented number of US forces in the region to help defend Israel, sending a clear message to both Iran and Hezbollah to back off. Post the October 7 attacks, Israel cut off electricity to Gaza before initiating airstrikes. Wait, how was Israel able to cut off electricity to Gaza? Well, 2/3 of Gaza's electricity comes from Israel, and this is paid for by the Palestinian Authority. The remainder comes from Gaza's sole power plant, but the fuel for that power plant also comes from Israel. And just to be clear, the total electricity from these two sources alone is not enough to supply Gaza's needs. Gaza usually has a 12-hour blackout every day. So after cutting off the electric supply, Israel Air Force pounded Gaza with airstrikes that targeted Hamas using its AI software, Habsora. 2 days later, on October 9, Israel Defense Minister Gallant announced a complete siege of Gaza, with fuel and food supply being cut off as well. This drew a lot of criticism from Human Rights Watch, and there was a lot of pressure from the US, and ultimately Israel backed down and struck a deal 10 days later to allow aid into Gaza. And the first aid convoy subsequently entered Gaza on 21st of October. The fuel arrived only in November. On October 13, the Israeli military ordered all civilians in Gaza City to evacuate to areas south of the Wadi Gaza River. A 6-hour window was identified for the Palestinians in Gaza City to flee to the south along specified routes. However, an explosion took place that killed 70 Palestinians along one of the safe routes. Israel and Hamas blamed each other, and there were reports that Hamas was setting up roadblocks to prevent Gaza residents from evacuating. And several intergovernmental organizations did condemn Hamas's use of hospitals and civilians as human shields. By October 17, Israel started bombing areas of southern Gaza as well. To get to the Hamas and capture their leadership, on October 27, Israel launched a large-scale ground invasion into northern Gaza. But gradually it became clear that Hamas were largely hiding in the underground tunnel network, nicknamed Gaza Metro by the Israelis. A tunnel network which was hundreds of miles long and extended under homes, schools, hospitals, and United Nations facilities. And the Hamas fighters, wearing civilian clothes, would suddenly emerge from these tunnels, shoot at Israeli soldiers, and attach mines to their tanks. And on November 19, 2023, Hamas's allies in Yemen, the Houthis, joined the conflict. They launched their first attack in the Red Sea by hijacking a cargo ship, the Galaxy Leader, which was reportedly partly owned by an Israeli businessman. And this started a campaign of missile and drone attacks in the Red Sea against shipping. While Israel was getting frustrated with its inability to capture Hamas leadership and fighters, Qatar was able to mediate a 4-day ceasefire, which was renewed twice between November 24 and December 1. This allowed fighting to pause and humanitarian aid to enter Gaza, along with an exchange of captives on both sides. Hamas released 50 women and children out of the October 7 captives, whereas Israel released 150 Palestinian women and children. Once the ceasefire started, diplomats across the globe assumed that the renewals would keep happening and ultimately become permanent. That is, the war would end. The October 7 mastermind, Yahya Sinwar himself, assumed that more and more prisoners would be released on both sides and ultimately lead to a permanent ceasefire. But the truce collapsed because of a major glitch that was fundamental to the success of the ceasefire. Hamas was unable to locate several captured female soldiers that were to be released next. Instead, it offered a handful of elderly civilians and the bodies of a few dead Israelis, which the Israelis refused outright. And just to be clear, as I'd mentioned in the previous episode, this happened because a lot of Gaza civilians too crossed over into Israel after the border defenses were breached on October 7 and came back with a few captives. And over a period of time, Hamas lost track of where each of these captives were. So at this time, the ceasefire collapsed and Israeli troops surged southward towards Khan Yunis, where Yahya Sinwar was believed to be hiding. Now, there's a reasoning provided by diplomats as to why both sides hardened their stance with respect to the negotiations. The primary culprit here is the United States. Yahya Sinwar felt encouraged by the open criticism of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu by the United States. But in private, the US continued to supply arms to Israel. So Benjamin Netanyahu himself did not feel any pressure to compromise. So while Yahya Sinwar hardened his stance, counting on the US pressure on Israel, Israel didn't feel the need to compromise because technically there wasn't any pressure. Subsequently, on January 12, 2024, the US and British warplanes started bombing Yemen to deter the Houthis from their constant attacks on the Red Sea traffic. But this response turned out to be more symbolic than impactful because the Houthis were able to continue their attacks against Red Sea traffic. By March of 2024, scalability issues had started cropping up with respect to Israel's invasion of Gaza. Essentially, Israel was capturing a specific region or a spot, moving on to capture another region, and then having to come back to the previous region because Hamas had re-established its presence and authority since the Israelis had left. This pattern was repeated in several places across Gaza, where the Israeli military had to return 2 to 3 times to redo a job they had already completed. And that is primarily because Israel has had no exit strategy with respect to the war. They do not want to occupy the land because it will be a logistical nightmare for them. And they also do not want an alternate political entity like the Palestinian Authority to run the affairs of Gaza. In spring of 2024, though, some senior Israeli military officials, without the approval from the political leadership, allowed a group of their Palestinian Authority counterparts to enter Gaza to rebuild the authority's capacity on the ground. But this was done in a very half-hearted way and never scaled up. As Israel was pushing Gaza residents further south, Rafah, close to the Egyptian border, had become an important refuge for about 1.4 million Palestinians. From the perspective of the international community, this was a clear red line. But in May of 2024, Israel breached this red line, creating a humanitarian catastrophe. Israeli forces invaded Rafah, blocking Rafah's border crossing with Egypt, which was an important entry point for aid and also an important exit point for those fleeing the war. Under immense pressure from the International Court of Justice, Israel decided to come back to the negotiating table. A deal started to get inked, which included a temporary 6-week ceasefire, release of 30 hostages in exchange for a few hundred Palestinian prisoners, and Israel withdrawing from Gaza during the ceasefire. But on July 28, 2024, when the deal was just about to get signed, Israel introduced last-minute changes, which pushed Hamas to back off. But why? A simple answer: the far right. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been clinging to a very weak political rope for survival, and this rope is controlled by the far-right members of his coalition government. These members of the far right were not happy with the deal, and putting his own political survival ahead of the interests of his country, Benjamin Netanyahu walked away from this deal. 3 days later, on July 31, 2024, Israel achieved a major victory with the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, a top leader of Hamas, in the center of Iran at a Tehran guest house. The bomb that ended his life had been hidden approximately 2 months back in the guest house. A guest house that was run and protected by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards of Iran. Ismail Haniyeh was in Iran's capital for the inauguration of the new president when the bomb was detonated remotely once it was confirmed that he was inside his room at the guest house. And then on September 17, 2024, thousands of pagers across Lebanon exploded. Hezbollah had recently received a shipment of pagers after their leader Hassan Nasrallah had insisted that their members stop using mobile phones to avoid being hacked or targeted by Israeli aerial attacks. The pagers were AR-924s from Taiwanese company Gold Apollo. But the company quickly announced that it had just authorized a Hungarian company called BAC to use the Gold Apollo trademark for certain regions. When Israel found out that Hezbollah was on the lookout for Gold Apollo pagers, it hired the Gold Apollo saleswoman that Hezbollah was using to make this purchase. Israeli spy agency Mossad then set up shell companies, including one in Hungary, and were able to dupe the Taiwanese company into partnering with them. Explosives were placed inside the pagers, and tests were conducted, one to ensure that the explosive was effective, and 2, to validate that the pager could pass airport security without triggering any alarms. Mossad knew that Hezbollah would run these through airport security scans to ensure these had not been tampered with and explosives introduced. But introduction of explosives made the pagers bulkier. But Mossad still managed to sell these to Hezbollah by touting other features like their robustness, being dustproof, waterproof, and having a long battery life. By September of 2024, Hezbollah had 5,000 such pagers in their pockets. Just an additional piece of information. This was not the first time that Mossad had come up with this strategy of weaponizing a communications device. 10 years earlier, Mossad had sold thousands of walkie-talkie radios to Hezbollah, which were filled with an explosive device. So on September 17, 2024, at 3:30 p.m., pagers all across Lebanon started beeping and exploding. There was complete mayhem on the streets. Pagers blowing up, hospitals filling up with the wounded, limbs and fingers torn off, bloodied, blinded, holes in the stomachs. So mayhem, which ultimately created a psychological fear among the Hezbollah. And the very next day, Mossad finally activated the walkie-talkies that had been dormant for 10 years. And some of these went off at the funerals of those killed by the pagers the previous day. All in all, about 30 people died, including 2 children, and 3,000 were injured. The aim of this operation was not to kill the members of Hezbollah. It was to send a message that Israel was the one in control, thereby instilling fear and paranoia among the ranks of Hezbollah. And with the walkie-talkies going off the next day, the paranoia reached such a level that people were afraid to even turn on their fans and light bulbs. The Hezbollah commander, Hassan Nasrallah, appeared defeated when he addressed the surviving Hezbollah fighters a couple of days later. And it was no surprise that within 10 days, Hassan Nasrallah was assassinated in a massive airstrike over Beirut, which also killed a prominent general of the Iranian paramilitary Revolutionary Guard, General Abbas Nilfurushan. Then on October 17, 2024, one of Israeli military units was patrolling an area of Rafah in southern Gaza. 3 Hamas fighters were identified and engaged by the Israeli troops, and all 3 were eliminated. Later, when the dead were inspected, one of the bodies was found to be that of the Hamas leader, Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind of the October 7 attack. And with this backdrop of several leaders across Hamas and Hezbollah being eliminated, the United Nations put forth a proposal for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza on November 20, 2024. The resolution was put forth by the 10 elected members of the Security Council, but failed to pass due to the negative vote of one permanent member, the United States. For a resolution to be adopted, it must secure at least 9 votes in favor and no negative votes or vetoes by any of the 5 permanent members. The ceasefire resolution secured 14 votes in favor and the 1 negative vote by the United States. So what has been the extent of the human toll as a result of this war? As of March 2025, the death toll has now surpassed 50,000, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry. Of the identified dead, about 55% are estimated to be women, children, or the elderly. According to Israeli officials, about 20,000 Hamas fighters have been killed, which makes the ratio about 1 civilian killed for every Hamas militant. While Israel takes the brunt of the blame for this massive civilian death toll in Gaza, one must not forget that there are 2 variables in the equation. The high death toll is a result of Hamas's willingness to base its military operations in civilian areas and Israel's willingness to pursue them there regardless of the consequences. But there is a semblance of hope for peace in that region. There have been several protests within Israel directed at Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to bring an end to this war. But recently, in March of 2025, the people of Gaza collected in thousands on the streets to protest against Hamas. The crowds chanted anti-Hamas slogans and called for an end to the conflict with Israel. With the war having stretched for more than a year, it may be time for a change of leadership across both sides to start a serious effort towards peace in that region. And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which US defense manufacturer has helped Israel build its David Sling missile defense system that provides middle layer of protection against shorter range ballistic missiles? The answer is B, Raytheon. Question for the current episode. Prior to the October 7 attack, when did Israel withdraw its military from Gaza? Was it A, 1967, B, 1948, C, 1973, or D, 2005? Once again, prior to the October 7 attack, when did Israel withdraw its military from Gaza? Was it A, 1967, B, 1948, C, 1973, or D, 2005? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another interesting and informative episode on world history. So do tune in. But till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.